you ever feel like you want to be better prepared for emergencies, but aren't sure where to start or how to find the time with all of your other responsibilities? We hear you, and that's where Preparedness in Your Pocket comes in. This podcast is your portable solution for accessible emergency preparedness education. Our episodes are pocket-sized yet packed with important preparedness information, making them easy to digest and learn from wherever you are. Preparedness in Your Pocket is brought to you by the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network, a dedicated communications network providing no-cost emergency preparedness education, training, and resources to home and community-based professionals, patients, and their caregivers. My name is Kendal Lee, and I am the EPN's Program Administrator and your host. On behalf of the EPN, we invite you to make this podcast an essential part of your preparedness toolkit. Just like keeping your keys and wallets close, think of this podcast as your preparedness partner, on the go, always ready to support you with valuable emergency preparedness tips. Join us as we empower you to be better prepared for emergencies, one podcast at a time. Hello and welcome. It's your preparedness partners here at the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network. Thrilled to bring you our very first episode of Preparedness in Your Pocket. I am Kendal Lee, your host, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to connect with you today from wherever you're listening. At the EPN, we believe preparedness starts with awareness, and education is how we build on that foundation. And because we also believe that sharing is caring, we're excited to bring you tools and tips through conversations that can help you stay ready no matter what comes your way. In this first episode, we're focusing on one of the key pillars of preparedness: emergency alerts and warnings. After all, we can't prepare for what we're not aware of. We're so grateful to have an incredible guest with us today, Jacqui Robinson, Community Preparedness Officer for FEMA Region 3, based out of Philadelphia. She's been with FEMA for 3 years, working in individual and community outreach. During her time at FEMA, she supported several disaster efforts, including deploying for the California statewide winter storms in April of 2023. Before coming to FEMA, Jacqui served in the New Jersey Army National Guard as a digital journalist for 6 years. She's happy to be with us today to share her knowledge and expertise in all things emergency management. Jacqui, I know you share a name with a famous baseball player, and though we are not here to play ball today, I have no doubt that you are going to knock this episode out of the park. So thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about all things preparedness, and hopefully the tips and things we have today will help some people.
I'm so excited to talk with you about emergency alerts. So to better understand them, I'd love to explore the who, what, when, where, why, and how behind these important systems. So are you ready to dive right in?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, I'm excited. Can you identify for our listeners the different types of emergency alerts and warning systems that we use in the U.S.?
Sure. So there are many different types of emergency alert and warning systems. The number one I'm going to mention is IPAWS. That's the Integrated Public Alert Warning System, and that is FEMA's specific responsible emergency alert system that we use that allows local, state, tribal, and federal officials to send out alerts and warnings to the public during emergencies. This helps ensure critical information reaches people quickly and effectively. Through IPAWS and distributing that information, we are able to also use systems like EAS, which is the emergency alert system, systems like WEA, which is wireless emergency alerts, things that you receive on your mobile phones, and short emergency messages like alerts that are imminent to threats, and even your Amber alerts are what comes through that WEA system. Then there's NOAA, which is our
Mhm.
National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and their weather radio system, which provides continuous broadcasts of weather information and emergency alerts. There's public safety alerts, which are more local and state authorized. And then tornado watches and warnings, which specific alerts are issued by the National Weather Service to warn about this type of activity.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that's so helpful. Could you speak to, I think, which ones are national versus which ones are local?
Okay, sure. So IPAWS is a national system that FEMA
Hmm.
uses. Now, FEMA is broken down into 10 regions. So we can regionally target messaging and geo-target messaging to specific areas if need be, depending on the disaster and what is happening. But this is a national system that is used and pushed out through other systems like
Okay.
WEAS
Hmm.
and through EAS. Your public safety alerts are
Hmm.
more of a local alert
Right.
system. These can come through many means, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later on today. But some of the means would be your local television networks and your media stations, as well as your local radio stations. Maybe print newspapers or online and digital newspapers as well will put out these alerts and warnings. So those are more of your public safety alerts that are more local and state focused. So you have the national systems like IPAWS, and
Hmm.
you have the more localized ones, which is your public safety alerts, and even your WEA and your EAS alerts can be targeted to be just
Hmm.
geographical alerts.
Okay, so it sounds like if I'm understanding it correctly, iPause is the big umbrella, and then the following alerts get trickled down through there all the way
Yes.
to
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
But it is all a team effort. I will say that because something I try to emphasize lately is FEMA would be nothing without the local and state emergency management. We work together with them to put out messaging that is
Hmm.
necessary. And it is our state and local emergency management that helps us fill the gaps in understanding what the community needs. If it wasn't for them, there would be this bridge gap. We're not in the community all the time. We are not the boots on the ground. The local and state community and emergency management, they're the boots on the ground that know their community better than anybody else, and they know what their community needs. So even though IPAWS is that overarching
Arching.
alert
Mhm.
system, we very much need connection and collaboration with the local and state emergency management and warning systems.
I really appreciate you saying that because I believe that the root of resilience is truly relationships. And again, I just appreciate you speaking to the interplay between the big picture nationally, but all the way down to like you and I locally in our
Yeah,
neighborhood. So thank you.
yeah, sure.
Okay, so now that we understand the different types of systems that exist, can we explore when these different types of emergency alerts are used and in what sort of situation should we expect to receive them, like a national alert versus a local, etc.?
Sure, sure. Um, First, I'm going to say that the alerts go out through different means, as we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Local authorities, you have your broadcast media outlets, and FEMA, and then your National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. When these alerts go out will highly depend on the situation, the scale of impact, and local weather reports and things
Mm-hmm.
like that, or even national weather reports, depending on, like I said, the scale of it. So that's part of the reason why we run exercises for these things. We constantly run exercises for these alert systems to figure out the reach, the gaps in wireless connection and rural areas and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll run these exercises so that way, when the time comes, we're a little more capable publishing them when need be.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to reach the audiences they need. But in terms of when, it will vary.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is a local emergency now, we try our hardest in this local emergency event to put out these warnings as quick, fast, and in a hurry, as you know. But there's also that window of not putting something out too soon, where then there's this lull until the disaster strikes and it no longer becomes relevant and people stop paying attention. But then you don't want something to be too late, because then all of a sudden the disaster is here and they had no time to react. So there is that healthy window that, like, I believe it's less than 14 days. We're not looking to stretch that whole 2-week window, and we try not to do anything closer than 3 days. Now, that doesn't mean no alerts will come out after that. There will be alerts that come out after that 3-day mark to constantly give you updates on where you need to be, evacuation orders and all these things. But in terms of, hey, there's a disaster that is going to hit your area that you need to know about, those alerts will come out a lot sooner. That's part of why I like that we run these exercises. I've been a part of many of these exercises where we test the alert warning systems. And when we test these, some things we see in the feedback we receive is asking people, was it clear? Was the instruction clear? Did you understand what the action was? Did you understand what this warning said and how it's reading? So most people, if you don't know, when these alerts and warnings go out, they're very well thought out, so that they will be best received and the most comprehensive. So we appreciate the feedback during those exercises to figure out, okay, maybe this type of messaging isn't working. People aren't understanding the preparedness action within this, and then we'll adjust accordingly.
Yes, I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's incredibly important. It's like practice makes progress, and I think it's important to practice these things so that when there is an actual emergency, and this isn't just practice for one or preparing for one, that the instructions are clear so that people can prepare the best way that they can. So thank you for sharing that. So now that we talked about the different types of systems and then when in which they're shared, could you speak to the ways in which or how they reach the public, like the different forums that these alerts can come through?
So as we all know, there's several different means of communication nowadays. Some of the means of communication are heavily digital. That's the world that we live in. So whether that be those mobile alerts, whether that be social media, emergency management pages, and websites for local emergency management, several weather-related apps. We have our FEMA app. There are other weather-related apps in NWS, and then visual and audio alerts. Some of those visual alerts, we're not just talking about television and broadcast networks. Yes, those are ones that we use as well. But then you do have your audio alerts, which are the sounds that you
Actual
hear
sirens.
in the neighborhood, the actual sirens that are going off in your area that people often go, well, what is that? Which one does that mean? Which is another reason why knowing your risk and understanding your alerts is so important. You should know what that siren means. And if you don't, we will help you figure it out. I will say that the FEMA app is great for that. There's a whole section on the FEMA app about alerts and warnings, and it will help you look up what that means. So it's good to know what those sounds mean. And then through emergency preparedness plans is also how we encourage these alerts and warnings through our resources that we already have at ready.gov and other areas. We encourage people to constantly go to these, and there are resources for alerts and warnings to figure out how to best sign up for notifications within your area, because it's also important to sign up for notifications.
Yes.
It's important to make sure that your mobile phone is set up to receive these WEA, these wireless emergency alert warnings. Not all phones are automatically set up and designed to receive these warnings. So it's important to make sure that your mobile phone is set up the way it needs to be set up to receive these notifications. So we try to put out the alerts and warnings in as many different means as possible, because there's so many different ways in which people need to receive the information. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit further down the line when we might discuss the equity and inclusivity of these alerts and warnings, but I do want to mention not just making sure that your mobile phone is set up to receive the WEA wireless emergency alerts, but also if you are someone who is deaf and hard of hearing, there's a different way in which your phone receives alerts. It will vibrate and there will be a flashing light, but making sure that your phone is also set up to receive that kind of alert, because that is a real thing too. And that is 1,000% available to those who are deaf and hard of hearing to receive those alerts on their mobile phone. So there's different things in which as an individual we can do to be prepared enough to receive these alerts and warnings.
I really appreciate you sharing all these things. It's really exciting for me too, I think, to pull up a chair in your classroom, because there's things that I have a foundational awareness of, but I'm also learning along with listeners. So I just appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise. So it sounds like that these emergency alerts come in multiple different forms, as many as possible, so we can reach as many people as possible through the different means, through the different channels. I just wanted to expand on one thing for a moment for really my own curiosity, but curiosity
Sure.
for listeners. So, when there's sirens that are an alert, who is responsible for releasing that alert or siren, like locally?
Local and state emergency management officers will be responsible for
Hmm.
putting those alerts out and putting those sirens out. There's a team that will work together during times of disaster. They'll usually set up their own operations center. So if there's more alerts that go out during that time frame, they will work together to put those out. But that initial alert and warning will be the local emergency management officers working with probably it varies depending on a community and
Hmm.
location, but they will probably work with the mayor's office and then work with several emergency services within that area. And then there's a specific team and a specific person that puts out the official siren, but they all work together. It is this communicative team effort to put these alerts and warnings out.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important to share, like, behind all of these digital communications that we receive. I think in our world and in this day and age, there's a person behind all of these communications before it reaches you or I or everyone in the community. So thank you for sharing more about that.
And just to mention too, it's very structured too, so people are just aware. This isn't like oh, I think this needs to go out. Let me push this button. They have very strict SOPs, standard operating procedures, and
Hmm.
guidelines on how and when to deliver these alerts and warnings. The space and the gaps in between these alerts and warnings. They have strict guidelines that says, oh, there's a 30-minute window from this being pushed out to this leadership that now 30 minutes from there we need to push this out to like it's so standard and structured. None of it is fly by the seat of your pants. They're constantly working on this and paying attention and following these procedures to make sure they're providing the best opportunity for the community to stay safe.
I'm like, I could talk about this like off the podcast or in another episode, but I'm just so curious about the framework and the structure, right? Because that's so intentional. And I think that's so important in any form of communication is to have that set standard so that things can be as smooth as possible for people on the other side. So thank you for sharing that too. I feel like I'm learning.
And FEMA itself does have a division and personnel that are experts on specifically just alerts and warning systems and the operating procedures and how those happen. So who knows, there could be a future episode where we
Yes.
dive real deep into that and talk about how that works.
Yes, the dedicated team.
Yes.
And again, that's important to highlight that there's entire
Yeah,
teams
to
of
understand.
people that
Mhm.
are dedicated to look out for our safety. Could you again like paint the picture now that we have talked about these last few things, how the systems work together? So circling back to the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how like there's the iPause and then that trickles down all the way to locally. But could you press in a little bit more about how they work together?
Sure, sure. So there's several different ways in how they work together. Your
Mm-hmm.
your integration and redundancy, making sure that there isn't redundancy in messaging and that there isn't confusion and cross messaging that comes out. That's an important way in which we work together. So that integration and redundancy and preventing confusion in messaging because that can really disrupt the way the public receives communication. Also,
Mm-hmm.
real-time communication, this immediate dissemination of information. We have to work together to make that happen. So just because there's an iPod pause system doesn't mean that this iPause system will be able to, on their own, distribute all this information to all these different geographical areas that need it in the most timely fashion. No, this is why we need to work with the public alert systems, with EAS, with WEA, with local and state emergency management organizations to put out this information to make sure it's happening in a timely manner. And then the collaboration among agencies help us figure out the geographic specificity.
Mm-hmm.
where and which, if we're not in connection with the local and state emergency management, we won't necessarily know right away, boots on the ground, what area needs this information the most and when. They're there. They see it happening firsthand of like, hey, this is the area that is most vulnerable. So we're talking about the beforehand, right? So you might be like, hey, well, how are you supposed to know beforehand who's going to get hit the most? Well, that local and state emergency management, without a shadow of a doubt, knows the vulnerabilities in their own community. So it might not necessarily be where is the storm going to impact the most, although your meteorologist and local weather personnel will have that information, or at least a good grasp on that information. But also your local emergency management team, they know the most vulnerable areas of their community. Perfect example is people who do not have as easy access to transportation and evacuation routes. They might need longer to evacuate. So that means they're going to need these alerts and warnings first. They need to get out to them as fast as humanly possible because they need a longer evacuation time. So understanding these operations and the different vulnerabilities within each community is so important. And that's why we have to collaborate with these local emergency management teams. Because like I said, local emergency management, they're the family. They know we're the family friends, but they're the family, and so we got to ask the family, how does this work? Where can we help and where can we support and what's best? And then you have target messaging, making sure that we're putting out in the best areas, and then public awareness and preparedness, making sure that we are having these regular drills. We're providing public education campaigns to families and individuals, and we're encouraging people to sign up for these alerts. We have to work together to make that happen and make sure that we're showing everyone the different ways in which they can receive these alerts and warnings, how they're valuable to them, and produce this education. And working together also allows us to help promote each other. If the local emergency management has something going on and they're educating people on these systems or on preparedness operations, what better way than to ping us, and then we will help amplify that message. Amplifying messaging is what we do. It's what others do, and working together to amplify messaging is how we reach broader audiences. And reaching the most amount of people is extremely important during these times.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I always say that teamwork makes the dream work. And again, that relationships are at the root of resilience that I shared earlier. And I think that what you're speaking to or what you're highlighting is that every single person brings their own level of expertise based on the lens that they're looking through, and everybody's voice is valued. Everybody plays a part or is a part of the big puzzle in promoting community-wide resilience, which I think brings me to the whole community approach that FEMA takes. And with that being said, because there's so many different forms of alerts and different systems, I want to speak to the inclusivity and accessibility of those alerts. Like, how does FEMA, through their approach, and really these other systems that you could speak to, prioritize inclusivity for the community?
Sure. This is really important, especially because America is a melting pot. It's my favorite part about it, and it's what makes America beautiful, is that there are so many different kinds of people. There's so many different cultures of people. The best way to stay safe and the best way to create the best outcome in a disaster operation is to work together. But how do we work together if there are these differences and gaps and we're not trying to be inclusive to all these different types of people? So some of the ways in which we include this are making sure that we're developing multilingual alerts, making sure that many jurisdictions provide alerts in multiple languages to cater to diverse communities and ensure non-English speakers have methods of receiving information, right? But then also making sure we're utilizing diverse media outlets. The alerts should be disseminated through various channels of media, through radio, television, text messages, email, social media, but all different. So maybe the smaller media networks, but they are more bilingual or multilingual, and they provide a demographic of news media that we haven't reached or unable to reach by if you're constantly just producing messaging to the same large scale English speaking media outlet, there is a whole bunch of people in these different smaller communities that we're not reaching. And this is why it's also important to have conversations with your community and able to have these conversations with the Spanish community in Philadelphia to say, hey, what are your best news outlets? Where do you get your information so that we
Mhm.
know who to reach out to when these times occur? And then we've talked about people living with disabilities, making sure that there are assistive devices available for people living with disabilities. For example, captions for TV broadcasts, compatibility with hearing aids, or text telephones that enhance accessibility. And a couple other things we have is the braille readers, we have wall
Mhm.
readers, sign language interpreters, video remote interpreting. So those are a couple of ways for people living with disabilities. And then alert signals and audio notifications. And then we have several community outreach programs. And in these outreach programs, this goes back to what I was talking about public education and the agencies, specifically FEMA Region 3, as well as the other regions. We're constantly conducting outreach within different communities and making sure that we're asking the questions too. So in terms of being inclusive, it's hard to know what a community needs if you don't ever ask them. If you never ask that community what they need and where the information gaps are and what they're struggling with, how could you truly know? You're basically working off of assumption. And this is where it's important for us to develop the relationship within these
Mhm.
different communities so that we could ask, where are your information gaps? Where are you struggling? What is the best means for receiving this information and communication? And how can we fill these gaps? So that's the testing and feedback phase of all of this. And then mobile applications and user-friendly apps that are very easy for people to use and easy for people to get involved with. Sometimes another community is the older adult community, making sure that it is through a means that is easily identified through
Mhm.
applications. And that is certainly not to diminish the intelligence of the older adult community. They're extremely intelligent, but digital communications and digital means of receiving information, what is and was not their primary means for receiving information. And that's based on the feedback we received when we hosted our older adult summit that
Mhm.
we hosted last year, where again, goes back to the testing and feedback phase. We brought the older adult community in to ask them, hey, what do you need from us? What are you missing? Where are these information gaps and how can we fill them? And that's when we got that feedback where most of them expressed that the means of digital communication information is very confusing and they would love for it to be a little more simplified. So we heard that and we took measures to create better information and more comprehensive and concise information. So those are just some of the ways. I could probably go into depth with that for quite
Mhm.
a long time, but those are just some of the ways in which we utilize that information.
I really appreciate you touching on that. A few things come to mind as you share. The first and foremost is that reconnecting the point that your voice is valuable. Something that I shared earlier, that I think we individually are all the experts on ourselves, and then whatever communities that we are a part of, we have expertise there. So I think it is wonderful to hear that there's such a dedication and commitment by FEMA, for example, to survey the community that they serve and view their voice as essential in their creation and design of the tools in which they put forward.
I do want to plug before we continue
Sure.
in terms of, so we use the term survey the community, but this month right now in September is National Preparedness Month. And our focus and our theme for this month is start a conversation. So it's not necessarily, we're not just trying to, fill out forms and check boxes, but we're trying to really develop this ongoing conversation that is necessary in order to create the most effective preparedness that receives the best possible outcome. So we're trying to bridge these gaps by this ongoing conversation, by this ongoing community outreach, by hosting roundtables and having conversations with the community.
Yes, and that's again why I was just so excited to have you on as a representative of FEMA. A goal of mine, and really on behalf of the EPN, is to connect our local community, wherever you're listening, to our listeners here, to FEMA, that there is a voice behind the
Yeah,
name and a face, although you cannot
yes, yeah.
see Jacqui's lovely face, though I can. Um, to you, so that there can be that connection, that this can be an ongoing um, personal relationship and person-centered and community-centered relationship. So again, I appreciate you speaking to all of that, and appreciate you speaking to, again, the focus or the theme of this year, which is the starting a conversation and then the commitment to having it ongoing, because our lives are ongoing, right? I think they ebb and flow in the everyday, and it's important.
Start a conversation, not
Mhm.
have a conversation.
Start one.
Start with conversation, which implies that this is just the beginning.
Yes, it implies the comma. It implies the dot, dot,
Yes,
dot, that
yes, yes.
this can continue on. So I'm grateful for you sharing that. And again, thanks for speaking to all the different ways that FEMA and other alert systems are committed to accessibility, inclusivity. I think that that's a lens in which we should look through, no matter what the context is in life, is including the entire community, no matter what role that you serve in. But particularly, I think for our listeners here, it's something that I had in mind, because we serve the home care, home health, and hospice population. We serve the providers, the patients, as well as their caregivers. And particularly when thinking of the patients or the caregivers, if you're living with a disability, if you are living with any chronic illness that impacts your ability to be able to have accessible alerts, I just think this is incredibly important, again, for all community members, but for our listeners here, in our local community that we particularly serve, to understand that we see you and we hear you and we care for you and are here to support you, and with your voice in mind. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, of course.
Okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit. So we talked about the different types of alerts, when in which they are sent out, how through all the different channels, and then how they reach everybody. So I wanted to press into when someone receives an alert, how in which they should respond. And I can understand and appreciate that that's very situationally dependent, right? It's all circumstantial based on what it is. And there may be a whole other episode just on the meanings of the different types of
Sure.
alerts and warnings. But I would love to hear you speak on those things.
Now, although you could say it's very different depending on what the alert is and who's receiving the alert, there are some standard practices and
Mm-hmm.
standard actions that should be taken. Number one is stay calm. Number one is stay calm, because sometimes when we receive an alert or we hear a warning or something like that, it can be very nerve-wracking, be scary. It's what's happening. It's important to note that the initial warning is usually to let you know that something is going to happen. So stay calm, receive the alert, and don't panic. Next is, after you've stayed calm, the next step in that is to read and listen carefully. Read and or listen carefully. Pay close attention to the alert details, including the type of emergency, affected area, and any possible instructions that are being provided. Make sure that you're paying attention. Often, if we panic or we let our emotions get heightened in those situations, we miss key information that's given. So the whole point of the warning and the whole point of the alert is to give information, give
Mm-hmm.
necessary information. So make sure you're listening to what that information is. Then, if you can, verify information. So you might receive a warning that says there could be possible evacuation orders in your area. Once you hear that, verify this information of what area they're actually talking about. Maybe they're not talking about you, maybe they are, but do a little bit of a deeper dive. And you're like, wait a minute, well, how can I verify this information? Like, well, that's where your local news comes in handy. That's where the official social media sites for these emergency management
Mm-hmm.
officers come in handy. The emergency management websites, there are whole teams of people dedicated to constantly updating necessary information for the public. So check it out, stay connected. We are so blessed to live in a time where it is easy to stay digitally connected to all these emergency management organizations. That did not used to be a thing. We are able to stay connected, and we're so blessed to be able to stay connected. It's as easy as following a Facebook page to receive these updated informations. Next, stay informed. Keep updated on the situation through reliable news sources, weather radio, official alerts, and because the conditions may change rapidly. An alert and warning or information that you received 20 minutes ago might change based on what the weather decides to do, because as we all know, the weather decides to change. I joke all the time, I'm from New Jersey, okay? I am from New Jersey,
Right.
which means you could walk outside in the morning and need a winter coat and some rain boots for 20 minutes later for it to be 85 degrees and you want to sit on the beach. You don't know what you're going to get in New Jersey. And then by the time it hits 7 p.m., all of a sudden it's snowing. That's what we joke about in New Jersey because it's so true. The fluctuation of what you're going to get, you
Yes.
put a rain jacket and a snowsuit in your car while you're wearing your bathing suit to go to the beach. You just don't know. So it's important to stay updated with these alerts and warnings because it could change at the drop of a hat, and especially in the East Coast. We're not known for being the typical 70-degree weather every day,
Right.
all day. That's not us, guys. I'm sorry. It's unfortunate. Sometimes we wish it was us, but that's not us. So it's important to stay up to date and informed of what's going on. And then make sure that we're communicating these alerts and warnings. Communicate these alerts and warnings to your loved ones, to your community, maybe your neighbors. If you know you have an older adult neighbor who maybe might not be staying as up to date, or maybe doesn't have the access to technology, maybe they're hard of hearing, whatever the case may be, it's important that we look out for each other and help others where we can. So if you have the ability and you're blessed to have the ability to help others, take advantage of that ability and make sure that you're reaching out to your community.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm laughing as you're talking because in the corner of my eye, I have the FEMA app, and so on on my phone, I just received a notification of an alert, but in the forefront of it, it says update, and so that's great to know that it's an
Yes,
update
update. It's
as
an
you
update.
just
Yeah.
mentioned,
Yeah, yeah.
right, as things change, resources like FEMA, the FEMA app, etc., are dedicated to keeping you updated as things change. So I really appreciate you.
No problem. I totally get it. New Jersey just recently had an earthquake. And trust me, most New Jersey people are like, hold on, we don't get earthquakes.
Right.
Nobody, if you watch it, oh man, it's hilarious. And I'm from New Jersey, so I'm allowed to say
Hmm.
this, I'm a fellow New Jerseyan. But you watch those videos and of when it happened and people in a restaurant, we did not know how to act. We did not know what to do. We said earthquakes don't happen to us. This is terrifying. And then 2 minutes later, everybody went about their business because it was a very, very low level earthquake. There was no damage done, by the grace of God to say. But so we were very fortunate in that area. But that also brings me back to the point where it's important to understand all natural hazards, be
Yes.
aware of them, and just understand some preparedness actions so you know when the right time is to take extra action and when the right time is to stay calm and understand that the risk is low. So know your risk. So
Yes, absolutely. I'm like, that's a key part to preparedness.
yeah.
Could you press into why it's really invaluable and important for us to stay connected as an individual, but also, as a community?
Well, I'm going to lead with the fact that you said as a community, because it benefits community resilience as a whole. When
Hmm.
individuals stay connected with their community and local authorities, it fosters a sense of solidarity. And this collective awareness can lead to coordinated responses and support systems and support efforts. So sometimes, especially in America, like we have this habit of wanting to be independent and do things on an individual scale. And we don't always see the face value of staying connected as a community. And it's important to constantly emphasize this because there's so much more to a natural disaster occurring than just what happens in that moment, right? So there are resources that need to be allocated when a disaster strikes. There are evacuation routes, there are shelters, there are disaster resiliency centers, there are ways in which economically your community can be heavily affected through disaster. What happens to our community happens to us. We're,
Yes.
we're together in this. It's highly important. And this is why the number one thing I'm going to mention is community resilience. What happens to your neighbor affects you as well. It is not separated. We need to work together as a community to create better resilience so that we all land on our feet because we are one community and we can't survive without the other. This also will help increase access to resources and planning for quicker and more efficient recovery. And that's what most people want when a disaster strikes, right? They want quick, fast, and in a hurry to be back up on their feet and running. Well, in order to make that happen, we have to work together. And then also just constantly providing safety preparedness tips and things like that that show ways in which we can work together for getting those local emergency management warnings. And then the last thing I'm going to say, because I don't think it's touched on enough, is emotional well-being.
Yes.
Important to stay informed because staying connected can alleviate those feelings of isolation and anxiety during highly stressful times. Knowing that others are facing similar challenges fosters a sense of community and support. And it's part of the reason why we have these ready campaigns within FEMA, and they always have a theme. And it's based on what we feel and what we've surveyed and the feedback we received on what the community needs. So last year we had our Take Control in 1, 2, 3, and it was our it was focused on the older adult community, but
Yes.
it's valid to absolutely everyone. And the whole point of the Take Control in 1, 2, 3 is it is very easy during times of disaster to feel absolutely helpless. Like you have no control over what is happening to you. And we want to encourage people to know that that's not true. You have control. You are able to take individual and community preparedness steps in order to ensure that you are involved in your safety and what happens to you. It's not removed from you. It's directly connected. So you can take preparedness measures. You can take steps to stay safe. And I'm gonna not to go off on a tangent, but I always think it's important to mention. I have family of mine, right? And my cousin, I remember her saying like, yeah, but there's nothing you can do she lives in Florida. She goes, yeah, but there's nothing I can do to prepare for a hurricane. That's what she told me. I said, that's not true though. It's not accurate because even though, yes, if a huge hurricane strikes, it's scary. It could cause a lot of damage, but your capabilities on evacuation highly increase your likelihood of safety if you know what those routes are, if you have a plan for what your transportation is, whether you are able to drive, do you not drive, do you have older adults in your area. That plan creates it fills that gap and void of not knowing what to do in that situation. Often at times it's that freeze mode where a disaster strikes, it's a scary thing happening, everybody's evacuating, everybody's moving, and you freeze. And you're like, but I don't know what to do. You do if you have a plan. If you have a specific plan that maybe you wrote down and you communicated and you practiced with your family, then there's no gap in time. And anyone who knows in times of disaster, minutes can mean saving life.
Yes.
Can mean saving life. So yes, that gap in time where you're trying to figure out what your next move is could be the difference between the safety of the lives of your family and your loved ones and not. So it is extremely important. There are things you can do, not even to dive heavily into and mention the financial resiliency and economic resiliency of being prepared. That's necessary. And then it can get you back up on your feet and running. That's one of the biggest things that's important to note is you do have control, and we have the most control if we work together.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing and putting into context a personal story as well. I think that just helps personalize things for our audience because all of us have experienced one thing. And one thing that comes to mind for me is the public health emergency
Yes,
of
which
COVID.
FEMA is heavily involved in. That's important to note in terms of disasters and things. Most people think that they're on their own and they don't realize these federal emergency management agency, we were heavily involved with the COVID relief effort and putting out messaging and helping support response and relief to allocation of resources and different disaster recovery centers and things like that. But yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what both of us are really speaking to is that there are elements that are outside of our control, like the actions of Mother Nature,
Yeah,
if you will. We cannot control those things, but there
sure,
are elements that are always within our control. And
sure.
it's, by working together, by developing systems and structures and inclusive tools that we can better prepare to not only face, but I think move through
Yeah.
whatever comes our way.
It's a funny example, but like I have a 3-year-old, I have a toddler, right? You cannot control what your toddler is going to get upset about. I'm telling you right now.
Right.
But if I keep snacks in the car, I can mitigate the
Your
chance of
tools.
him getting upset that he gets hungry in the car and starts. I'm like, oh, here's a bag of Cheerios though. And all of a sudden I mitigated that risk of him freaking out because he got hungry. And I have a little boy who gets hungry every 20 minutes. So okay, you cannot control the reactions of a toddler are very similar to a natural disaster. You can try and predict, but you're not always going to know where they're
Right.
coming from and what they're going to do. But I will mitigate those risks by having an extra pair of clothes in the car because he's going to spill something, by
Yeah.
having snacks because he's going to get hungry. There are ways in which you can mitigate these risks, and there is many unknown factors, but there are also many ways in which we can handle those unknowns.
Yes. And thank you again for sharing another personal story, because I think what that story speaks to is that no matter what role you're in your life, because we play many roles, we wear many hats as individuals, we're learning and practicing on different levels, of course, to mitigate risk and prepare for things all the
All
time.
the time,
Right,
all
even
the time.
preparing for this conversation, together. We're always in the act of preparation, I think, as human beings. And so I think that just really does provide the reassurance that when we do feel like there are circumstances out of control, we have and had practice the act of preparedness, right? And we can do it in this way. We can take that skill that is already inherent and strengthen, that muscle. You
Yeah,
have to work a muscle to strengthen it, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
that's what we can do through
yeah.
conversations like these, and practicing a plan, or starting a conversation that
Starting the conversation, yeah,
starting a conversation that remains continuous, so that we can exercise our preparedness muscles, if you will.
yeah.
So I thank
And
you.
that's where it's important to make sure that you're utilizing your local emergency management and your local organizations, because it's not to say that you're not in control in those moments and that's why you're reaching out. That's not to say that. It's to say different people are experts on different things. So
Absolutely.
it's okay to get them involved. I know my father is a math teacher. I don't have to pretend like I have it all together when I homeschool my son and teach him math. And I'm like, this isn't working, Dad. You got some methods that work. Why
Right.
not alleviate some stress by leaning on those who maybe deal with these things on an everyday basis? So we at FEMA and your local emergency management and your state emergency management and all these organizations that are available to you, why not lean on them for
Yes.
this information, take some of that weight off your shoulders, and that is in itself inherently taking control of your own situation.
Absolutely. I think the theme of what we've been sharing is the resilience that comes from relationships, but also that every voice has value with what you've shared, and tapping into the expertise of others, no matter what that may be, like your father with math, or me connecting with you with your expertise on preparedness to touch on these things, is to reach out and connect with others in that way. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. So in speaking of all of these things in terms of expertise and tools and resources, I wanted to touch on some recommendations for any resources you may have. I know that we've touched on a few things here, and I just wanted to have you share about any resources you would recommend, like the FEMA app, etc.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the FEMA app number one is something I'm going to mention because I do think it's absolutely valuable. Part of the reason I think it's absolutely valuable is the FEMA app is going to direct you to other resources as well. So it's a great opportunity for if you want to find resources for several different things, you can check the FEMA app and it will show you different resources for whatever you're looking for. But beyond the FEMA app, ready.gov, please visit ready.gov. Ready.gov will provide so much information when it comes to being prepared, when it comes to the different natural disasters, what to look out for, and how in which we can mitigate risks. It has sections for financial capability and resilience. and different areas. It provides this information in several different languages. We provide resources for ASL and American Sign Language for those who need that service. So there's just so many different things on ready.gov I highly recommend. Also, I do want to shout out as well the importance of knowing your risk in your area. What is your location, your area, and your community most vulnerable to in times of disaster? We publish the National Risk Index. You can Google it, National Risk Index, and it will help you identify what your area and location is most at risk to face, what your vulnerabilities are, what to look out for. It's a great way to create a starting point. You might be sitting there saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know what my risks are. Go to that National Risk Index. Figure out what your vulnerabilities are and how you can start to mitigate. Go to National Risk Index and then pop yourself on over to ready.gov. Figure out what your vulnerabilities are and then figure out how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So those are just a few ways. And then, of course, visit FEMA.gov. A community preparedness site. You go to FEMA.gov and then under our tabs, click on community preparedness, and it will let you know how to get involved in community preparedness and start to also mitigate some of the risks from there. I'll constantly shout out the preparedness aspect because it's super important. Don't wait till it's too late. I'll use one more example before I close out because I'm full of my examples today.
Sure.
I train jujitsu. It's a huge passion of mine. I love it. I like to fight combat sports. I fight in lots of tournaments. I know I don't really look like it, this little, blonde girl. You guys can't see me, but I'm just this little nothing blonde girl. But I love to fight jujitsu. I wear knee sleeves every time I go. I wear these sleeves on my knees, and everyone always asks me, "Oh, do you have knee issues?" And I'm like, "Oh, no. My knees are fine. I don't want knee issues." I find a large part of the problem is people wait till something hurts and then they put a brace on something. I'm like, no. I know that I'm reaching 40 pretty soon. And I know that when you reach 40, your knees stink. So I'm going to make sure that I mitigate that risk. So that's the point of preparedness. Don't wait till it already happens and there's already a problem to realize you should have done something. Do something ahead of time to keep yourself safe and the ones you love.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. Okay.
Thank you. This has been great.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to get ready to wrap up today. I just want to say thank you so much, Jacqui, for joining me today and sharing your invaluable insights and expertise with our listeners. For everyone tuning in, we encourage you to sign up for emergency alerts in your area. Check out helpful resources that Jacqui mentioned, like the FEMA app or the National Weather Radio, to keep yourself and those you care for and care about connected. Remember, preparedness starts with taking small steps now so we can be ready when it matters most. Thank you again. It's been such a joy having you on the show. And
thank you, Kendal.
Yes,
it's been great.
To our listeners, your presence not only makes this work possible, but impactful. So we invite you to subscribe to Preparedness in Your Pocket. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others and help spread awareness in your community. Thanks again for tuning into our podcast where we make preparedness education portable. Until next time. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Preparedness in Your Pocket. This podcast is brought to you by the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network, formed in partnership with the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association and the Office of Preparedness and Response within the Maryland State Health Department. Our hope is to meet your curiosity with content that boosts your confidence and strengthens your preparedness. At the APN, we truly believe that sharing is caring. So we invite you to subscribe, like our podcast, and share it with friends, family, colleagues, or anyone in the community so that we may all empower each other's preparedness. Please note that the information provided in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal or professional advice. While our discussions may include topics and products offered by the participating organizations, listeners should consult with relevant professionals or authorities for specific guidance and recommendations. The views expressed by our guests may reflect those of the hosting organization, but are not intended to replace official advice or guidelines. We can't wait to connect with you again. Until then, stay prepared and take good care.